Okay, so firstly, just to say good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the New Architects Code. My name is Finn Tobin. I'm the Communications Manager at AIB, and I'll be your host for this session. Delighted to have so many of you joining us today. This webinar is intended to help you understand the new standards before the code comes into effect on 1st of September. We know how important it is for architects to feel confident and clear about what's changing, so we hope you find this session informative and practical. So before we get started, I just want to give a quick overview of what to expect from this session. So I'm joined today by Simon Howard, our Director of Standards at AIB, and he's going to kick things off with a presentation on the new codes. And after that, we're going to open up the floor for your questions. So at any point, if anything does come to you, any questions, feel free to start firing them in through the Q&A function on your screens. We're going to be running a few polls today as well, just to gather your views. So please do take part when those pop up on your screen and do keep an eye out for them. So if anybody needs it, we do have live transcription enabled for this session. So if that hasn't come up automatically, it should be there at the bottom of your screen under captions. There's an option to enable it. And you should have all got a notification for this as well, but we are recording today's session and we'll be posting it to our YouTube and sending it out to everybody who registered to be here today, whether they came or not. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm pleased to hand over to Simon, who's going to take us through the key updates in the new code.
Thanks, Finn. Afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry that I can't see your faces, but thanks for giving your time up at dinner time on a Wednesday lunchtime. So really appreciate it. I will try not to make this death by PowerPoint as we go through the code. But I think, as Finn said, it's really important with the new code coming into place that we explain a little bit about the rationale and the thinking behind the code and what it will mean for you as an architect. As Finn said, it comes into force on the 1st of September. And I'll explain now what the code, how the code has changed from the previous code and what the key elements are. If you want to move on to the next slide, please, Finn. So what's the purpose of the code? Well, ultimately, as a statutory regulator, we have to have a code. It's a requirement of the law that we have to have a code that sets out the standards of conduct and competence expected of all architects. The code that's currently in place was in place in 2000. It's been in place since 2016, which is a slight variation of the one that's been in place since 2012. So 12 years has passed really since this last substantive review of the code, and we thought it appropriate, given that all that's happened in terms of building safety and sustainability and EDI, society has moved on, the profession has moved on over the last 10 to 15 years, and it's really important that we have a code that reflects that. In looking forward as part of what the code should look like for everyone going forward, I think it's really important and helpful to look backwards. So one of the things we did in this exercise, actually, and interesting, was to look back at previous iterations of the code. There has, of course, always been a code of conduct in place, since the 1930s under our predecessor RCUC, but stretching all the way through from then till now. Quite interestingly, it was fascinating to see how codes have changed over time. So the 1970s code, for example, had really specific prescriptive information about what architects must and mustn't do, to the point where it would detail the size of the font that an architect can have on their advertising. And it was also really interesting to read that the code was entirely framed in a contractual way between the relationship between the architect and their client. There was no touch at all upon wider public interest or wider responsibilities that the profession might have to society. Code of conduct in relation to architects around the world, in relation to other professions, have moved on since then and become more principles based. And I think it's important that we reflect that within architecture as well. I guess one of the key questions we have throughout this exercise is, what's the purpose of the code? What's it really for, other than to say that we must have one? And it always struck me when we were going around the country talking to different architects about how they use the code. I was talking to an architect in Northern Ireland, a relatively experienced senior architect, and I said to him, when was the last time you looked at the code? And he says, well, I haven't really looked at it since I passed my part 3. And I was like, well, that's not very good. Why? And he says, well, it's in my desk drawer, but really it's just a long list of things that I'm not supposed to do or I can't do. And that's not very helpful to me in my practice. And that really struck a chord. So what we want it to be, the code, is a positive statement of what an architect does, what their professionalism is, what their ethics are. And it's not just for architects, it's to send a wider message out to the public, to government, to our stakeholders, and says this is what it means to be an architect. This is what it means to be a professional. So the public can understand that rather than it just being a list. It needs to be relevant to all architects, no matter where they're in practice and what sphere of practice they're in. And as I say, it doesn't repeat legal obligations, and we don't want it to be a long list of things that architects must and mustn't do. If that's what you're looking for from a code, this document won't provide it. Look, it needs to be relevant for disciplinary proceedings, and this is something that's really close to my heart because I'm responsible for kind of the disciplinary proceedings at ALB. I also recognise the fact that less than 1% of architects will ever be involved in any of these proceedings. So I think it's really important that kind of, for my purposes, we put on the back burner how it might be really useful in the context of being really prescriptive and detailed, which would be really useful in a legal case, and instead speak to the 99% of architects who won't be involved in that and will use it for a different purpose. So in a moment, I'm going to come on to the standards, but what I thought I might do is describe how the new code looks in conjunction with all the other information that we publish. So if you imagine in your head a concentric circle and standards, the standards would be the 6 standards would be at the center of that circle, and they're the mandatory standards. And I say I'll come onto those. I'll come onto those in a moment. And those are standards that every architect must always meet on all occasions with no exception. And I think when we come to those standards, you'll understand why. Sitting underneath those standards or in the next concentric circle outside of that, if you can imagine that, will be the example behaviors that how architects may want to meet these standards. Now, in most circumstances, these will be the behaviors that you would do in order to meet the standard, but they're not obligatory. There may be alternative ways that you can still meet the standard. There may be some standards that conflict with each other, and it will be important to kind of like be able to demonstrate that you've used your discretion in doing that. And then sitting outside of those standards, of those explanatory behaviors, will be guidance. And those guidance documents are more detailed documents on particular areas of risk or areas that architects have explained to us that they need some more information that really wouldn't sit within a code. They'd be much too detailed to sit within a code of conduct. And then, of course, finally, sitting outside of that will be the individual pieces of advice and guidance that architects may request from us as their regulator. And we've got a professional standards team that can advise on individual circumstances. So that's the structure of how it looks. What I'm going to do now is take you through the 6 standards of the code. It's relatively detailed, and I wasn't proposing to go through it in any detail. The whole document's up there online. But what I thought I might do is take you through the flavor of what each of those standards means, and then we can move through the presentation and you can ask me or Finn any questions. So Finn, if you move on to the first standard, and this is the standard that underpins any code of conduct, so no matter what profession you're in or where you are in the world, and that is that architects must always be honest and act with integrity because it's central to professional ethics. And as I just said, it is the foundation that underpins professional standards, and it's a little small on the reproduction deliberately because I don't want us to get caught up too much in reading the code in detail. But you will see on the left-hand side there this is how an architect will meet the standard when they do things like use impartial judgment, be responsible and accurate in the promotion of their services, declare and manage conflicts of interest. It talks about inducements and what you might want to call bribes in terms of that. It's really important to self-report is important and part of the code in order to, when you think that you've fallen down below, to self-report that, so that can be investigated and to cooperate with us. So if we go back to the principle again, at all times architects must act with honesty and integrity, and those are some of the examples about how they can do it, and that list is certainly not exhaustive. Should we move on to standard 2, Finn? And this, if we talk about the biggest change in the code from the existing iteration to the new version that's coming out in September, this is where it is manifests itself. The biggest change is the introduction that architects must always act in the public interest. And really, this is centered on two key principles, and that is using their best endeavors to enhance the environment and in relation to safety and building safety design. And it'll be no surprise that these two elements came out really strongly in our engagement, both with the public, with the profession, and were supported through the consultation that we had. We will be proposing to provide more detail on some of these, which are relatively, I accept the fact that they're relatively bare-boned, using one's best endeavours to enhance the environment. Quite clearly, that only gives a certain degree of detail as to what an architect must do in every situation. And we will be working with sector leads to make sure that we provide a bit more meat on the bones, certainly in relation to that. But standard 2 is the importance of acting in the public interest. Standard 3 is competence, and accepting the fact that not all architects, quite properly, will be competent to do everything, and we accept that. You're never going to be able to get a situation where an architect goes through their educational journey and comes to the point of registration. We accept the fact that, a bit like a driving license, that's a step on the journey. And there will always be further competence that every architect needs, no matter where they are in their career. The really important thing is that an architect is competent to carry out the work that they do, and they don't act outside of their competence, and they recognise this. I mean, one of the kind of many learnings that we found from the Grenfell Tower disaster is the importance of communication and accountability, but the importance that everybody involved is competent to be able to do what they say they can do. And understand the limits of those competence and step back when appropriate. It also enshrines the importance of continuing professional development, which is a really important element. And of course, we have the CPD scheme that we introduced at the start of the year. And one of the questions I often get by really senior architects is, well, I'm already competent. Why do I need to carry out CPD? And I think the answer we would always give to that is, well, two things. First of all, anybody can improve on what they do. And secondly, I think if you're a really senior architect, then you can show by way of example your commitment to developing your competence as you carry on, and as an example to younger members of the profession. So that's standard 3, competence. And then we turn to standard 4, that all architects must carry out their work effectively, exercising skill and diligence. And I think it's fair to say that this standard of the code is doing quite a lot of heavy lifting in terms of what it is to be an architect on a daily basis. And we know from the kind of problems that we get the architects run into, they're often actually not ethical, they're not ones of competence, they're quite often an inability or unwillingness to manage their work effectively, to do the hard work, the dirty work, in terms of administration, running the job properly, terms of engagement, which remains the #1 source of complaints to ARB, in terms of not providing adequate terms, and of course all the problems that then flow from that. So standard 4 is that they must carry out work with effectively exercising skill and diligence. And there is a relatively long list of examples of how the behaviours that would be expected of architects. But again, I'd stress that that's not definitive or exhaustive. And again, we're providing further guidance on that as we go along. There are 2 more, and the standard 5 is the importance of communicating and collaborating. And this is to recognise and acknowledge the fact that no architect acts in a silo. Well, certainly shouldn't act in a silo, and architects don't build buildings on their own. They inevitably work as part of a team, work with clients, work with contractors, work with other members of the design team, acknowledging the really important role architects have at the center of that design team. And with the introduction of the principal designer role, I think that has become even further highlighted and further enhanced that responsibility. So yeah, it's a really important to recognize the importance of collaboration and communication, and to kind of celebrate its importance in doing that. And there we have some list of examples: communicate in a way that's appropriate to the audience and understand and confirm clients' initial requirements before committing to work. these are the kind of soft skills that actually are really well valued as architects, and to actually takes architects, elevates them above maybe other design professionals who may have terrific design skills but don't have that higher level of communication and collaboration that architects would be expected to have. And then finally, is respect, and respect's already in the existing code, and you would find it in any code. But we also know that there was a report published, a piece of research carried out by ARB on the culture within the profession, and actually the RIBA published one, workplace culture, only a few weeks ago, and both of those painted a really troubling a really troubling picture of some professions, of some aspects of the profession within the workplace. So architects must always treat each other with respect. That is, I don't think anybody would really argue with that. We suggest that, and this is one of the things that came back from actually the public, of the importance of being polite and considerate, which is something that maybe we wouldn't always think of, and architects wouldn't say that's the most important part of it. But it's really interesting to see what kind of the public's perception of that are. Actually, the two things that came most strongly back when we spoke to the public about what they expect of architects would be safety. Unsurprisingly, the importance that architects will probably produce safe designs, and then rather more surprisingly, that they're polite and considerate. In fact, we had one respondent say that it's important that you have nice shoes when you go and see them. So do take that how you will, but of course then it talks about the importance of having a committed approach to ED&I, and the importance of having an inclusive working environment, which I think is becoming increasingly under the spotlight. So those are the 6 standards, and an example of how they sit below them. And then next we come on to guidance, and in a moment Finn is going to send out a poll to request suggestions, if you have any, on the kind of guidance that you might see or you might want to see from ARB. And this is where our role becomes less than clear, in the sense of, I think the guidance that the ARB must issue must relate to the code of conduct. For example, we're not going to be issuing guidance on technical aspects of architecture because we're not skilled to do that, and you have really competent professional bodies able to do that. So the guidance that we have there, that we're proposing there, is sat in front of you on the screen. So some of them are already been consulted on and published, and some of them are actually quite long-standing existing pieces of guidance, dealing with complaints, professional indemnity insurance, and really crucially terms of engagement, because as I say, terms of engagement is our highest risk, or architects' highest risk, in terms of things that go wrong. We currently have out for consultation, if you want to comment on those, how to identify actually and manage conflicts of interest, how to manage your professional finances appropriately, and raising concerns and whistleblowing, how and when to do that, which actually includes a lot of signposting to other places, because there are some situations that it's important that ARB wouldn't be the right place to whistleblow to. It might be the police, might be employment, might be so on and so forth, but we provide some more details there. And then we're working on some existing, some new guidance in relation to building safety, and we'll be working with our colleagues in the professional bodies across the nations to produce that. ED&I, leadership and mentoring, which we've identified. We've recently carried out a professional practice and commission on how students of the future can best achieve practical their professional practical experience. And one of the commission's recommendations was that architects, particularly those architects who are responsible for mentoring and providing training to trainees and students, ought to have some guidance on what it is to be a mentor. And then it's certainly in relation to sustainability as well. That's a really big piece of work, and it's a really big piece of work actually that is up for some debate about what best endeavours means. So when an architect must use their best endeavours to enhance the environment, what that means in practice for architects. That is a relatively quick whistle stop through the new code. Finn, I think I'm passing it back to you for a poll, and then look, I'm really happy to answer any questions anybody's got for the remaining time.
Yes, taking myself off mute. Thanks for that, Simon. That poll should be live now. So yeah, if there's anything that wasn't covered on that previous slide, yeah, we'd like to know what else would you like to see. And again, we've had a few questions already in the Q&A. If anything has come to mind during Simon's presentation there, please do fire in your questions. So I'll just give people another minute if people just want to think about those guidance topics just before we do move on.
Then why don't you leave it up while we start the questions?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, so just to kick off, I'm going to start with some of the questions that were submitted through the registration form. There's a question here from Mark. So it's a really good question. Mark has asked, the statements are very open-ended and quite easy to misunderstand. For instance, managing client expectations or being polite. Mark says, in a world of contractors, planners, building control, diversity, etc., how can you be polite and meet client expectations? So Simon, just the first part of that question, do you think it's fair to say the new code is intentionally open-ended?
Well, it's certainly the new code set the intention is to allow architects to use their professionalism and judgment rather than being treated like, I mean, some architects would love a big long list of rules if I can't do this and I can't do that. Ultimately, a list of rules kind of lets everyone off the hook. Lets us as a regulator off the hook, lets an architect off the hook when actually what we want is good outcomes. So I wouldn't say necessarily say open-ended, but to a certain degree, they're open for interpretation. I don't think the mandatory standards are open for interpretation at all. So, for example, I think the example was, must I always be polite? Well, no, you must always treat with respect. If there's a situation where, as an architect, you don't think it's appropriate to be polite, I'm trying to think of a scenario, I can't off the top of my head, but there may well be one. And polite does, has different connotations to different people. That's fine as long as you can still meet the requirement of that you've treated someone with respect.
Thank you. That makes sense. I'm just going to quickly take one of the questions that's come in through the Q&A. I can see that some people have their hands up. We aren't going to be allowing people to talk, but if you want to send a question in, please do use the Q&A function and we'll be able to deal with it there. So James has asked, will the new Architects code be available for purchase? And if so, where? So the new code has been published. It's live on our website. There isn't a physical copy available. It's available as a PDF, but by all means, do download it, do print it off, do share it widely. But no, there isn't a physical version to purchase, but by all means, that PDF is available on our website. We'll be sending out an email if you haven't seen it already with all of the links for everything we've been talking about today. And yeah, by all means, do print it off and keep a copy somewhere handy and convenient. So I'm going to go back to one of the questions that was submitted in advance. This question was from Callum. It's around sustainability. So Callum was asked, could the ARB go further in defining our responsibilities as architects to be good ancestors in terms of sustainable design? What are some of the considerations ARB has made, ARB has had to make, sorry, which have shaped its position on sustainability? I really like that expression, ancestors, in respect of sustainable design. But Simon, do you have any thoughts on that question?
It's a really difficult question. And I'm afraid, without meaning to sound like I'm kicking the can down the road, we need to do more work on it. I think that the standard is obviously must act in the public interest, and the example behaviour is architects should use their best endeavours. Now, actually, there was quite a bit of debate on the word best endeavours and reasonable endeavours, which have two separate meanings. Reasonable endeavours is, well, you can do something as long as it doesn't cause you any disadvantage. Best endeavours, it means actually it has a legal definition of you must still do it even if it does cause you some advantage, as long as that disadvantage is not entirely disproportionate. I think we need to do more work with the profession as to what that means, because ultimately we have to recognise that architects don't always have agency. Architects aren't making the final decisions when it comes to some of these design questions in relation to sustainability. Clients are. So I think we need to have an open conversation about, first of all, what competencies an architect should have, certainly in terms of being able to offer the best advocate, to be able to advocate and offer the best advice to their clients, but also what their responsibilities are actually in terms of I shouldn't go further. If my client is doing something that's completely opposite to what we think is in the public interest in relation to sustainability, what duties does an architect have to step back from that? And that's the piece of work that we still need to do. And that's not something ARB can dictate. that's something where we have to seek the views of the profession and say, actually, this is the collective view of the profession. This is where we should. This is the threshold that we collectively agree that shouldn't anyone should go below.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Kind of like a politician's answer, but that's
No, I mean, I would say, I mean, there is guidance sort of forthcoming. And again, we're sort of taking ideas from people today. I mean, any piece of guidance that we are publishing as well, it is going to be available for consultation. So yeah, we are asking people to share their views and to let
one
us
thing I
know.
would say to that though, if people are interested, the BSI are currently creating a new British standards in relation to sustainability. So anyone who's really interested in that should go and have a look at that work, because I think that's still currently out for consultation, if not development. So it's a live piece of work, and quite clearly, a industry standard is going to help us inform our work. Of course, that industry standard applies to not just only architects, and we're entitled to say actually we want our standards to be different from that, but it will certainly be instructive.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question here from an anonymous attendee. Will R produce templates for areas like engagement terms, contract for small practices who do not have access to legal or commercial advice? So, I mean, is that an avenue that you think we would go down?
No, I don't think that would be appropriate for us as a regulator to do that. What we can do is we can send the new guidance on terms of engagement is relatively prescriptive in the sense of these are all the things that you need to have in your terms. So if you follow that guidance, then that will comply with the code. We also advocate actually for architects where possible to use the standard contractual terms that are produced by the RIBA and RAS and others, only because they're really robust documents that have been pored over by lawyers, and contracts, particularly as the projects get longer. We talk about duties of responsibilities and liability. I don't think it's our position to be able to produce that in a way that architects can rely on, but we can certainly signpost to the right people. But it's complex. It's incredibly important, particularly about kind of sharing liabilities, allocating responsibilities and liabilities. And I think that architects need to get their own particular advice on that. But I appreciate the fact that small sole practitioners won't be able to go and get kind of like bespoke legal advice every time they enter a contract. So that's why I would kind of advocate for either create your own terms based on the guidance we're giving, or use the RIBA standard terms or the RAS standard terms, because they've been so well thought out.
Mhm. There's an interesting question here, and it'll be interesting to see the ideas we've got from people on that poll that we just ran. It's a question from Annie. Will there be any future guidance on the use of AI, opportunities and risks?
Quite possibly, yes. I mean, if the profession is saying AI's kind of come across, I mean, it's come at speed, I think, to everyone. So certainly, kind of, it probably wasn't. We weren't envisaging that when we first started developing the code, but it's becoming increasingly at the forefront of everyone's mind, and it's clearly there are ethical aspects to AI. So if the profession is saying we want some guidance on this, and we see it as being a risk, then certainly we'll put that into the pot for things that we need to think about producing guidance on. I'm not quite sure what would be in it at the moment, but that's not the point.
There's a question here from Justin as well. So, were architects' codes from other countries reviewed when reviewing the UK codes? And if so, did they shape the UK codes?
Yes, they certainly were. Actually, it was actually a really interesting exercise that there's not a huge amount of difference between codes generally, not even just architects' codes, but there's a huge amount of sharing and synergy between any professional code. You have things like honesty, integrity, competence, client care, public interest. All of those things are relatively shared across. Probably public interest is one that's we're pushing further within the UK code, but particularly some of the older international codes that we looked at. Some are still much more prescriptive than our code. I think the American ones, they have different ones, but they were really quite lengthy, and that's not a route that our board wanted to go down, which I think is the right one. But in terms of content, and then I think there's very little variance between them. It's a good question. It's really interesting
Mhm.
analysis to do.
There's a question here, and I apologize if I mispronounced this. Desislava. Would the new code of conduct be what we need to refer to throughout the APS exam in November? So it's a question really, I suppose, about the currency of the new code, I think.
You would need to check with your Example, I would certainly hope so. I would certainly hope that kind of the examination bodies will have updated their procedures to reflect the new code. But that's something you'd need to check with them, because this is a matter of timing. I don't know when they, for example, would have drafted their exam questions, and I'm alive to the fact that this has only just been published, so it's something you'll need to check with them.
Yeah, thank you very much. Um, There's a question here. I think it's an interesting one, really, and maybe it sort of gives us a chance to delve into one of the standards in a little bit more in depth and our thinking behind it. Francis has asked, why have you used diligence instead of care in standard 4?
I can't answer that question directly, but I can tell you the process but behind which we arrived at all the words. So we produced a draft of the code and sent it out for consultation. And I think off the top of my head, we had about, Finn, you might misread me, 800 or so responses, hundreds of responses, all of which had individual drafting changes on individual parts of the code. So there's a huge kind of like a huge framework and mass of drafting changes. And I think ultimately we had to test out each one, look at the kind of comments that people gave back and say this word is better than that word, and ultimately arrive on what we thought was the best one. And obviously in this case, I can't recall why diligence was used over care, but that would have been the process that we went through of what it means most to architects. A lot of the word changes were architects going, I don't understand what this means. This doesn't mean anything in our context. And we want it to be meaningful to architects. So that's why we would have taken that decision, not just in relation to that wording, but in relation to all of them.
Yeah, thank you. We've got a question here from Duncan, which again I think is an interesting one. The presentation makes a really good point that architects do not work in isolation. They're a central part of a project team. In the interests of collaboration, has the ARB looked across the construction industry to harmonise the code principles with other professional bodies? Can you speak to that again, sort of about how we develop the code? Can you speak to what was our thinking in terms
Yeah,
of how we fit with other parts of the built environment?
so we met with and consulted with all of the other major players within the built environment, the other professional bodies. Of course, we are the only statutory regulator, so we're slightly different, because we need to the purpose of our code must be more public interest centered, because we're a public interest regulator, than the other bodies. So for example, the architectural technologists or the Chartered Institute of Buildings, or any of them, ultimately they're professional bodies who are there to advocate for their members. So there is a slightly different lens through which we look. What we did say is, here is our code. Do you think this causes you any problems in relation to kind of the working relationship? And we took into account any feedback that they had. We also took into account the work that the Edge has done. So the Edge is a kind of cross-cutting think tank, you might describe it, who's certainly advocating for this one-stop code. To be honest with you, it's not possible. I don't think it would be wonderful if we had a collective code across all the built environment professionals, and it may well be that we can get there in the future. There's a lot of talk about single overarching regulator and more harmony, and the government's trying to create more harmony within the sector. But I don't think that would be practical in the short sense, but certainly an aim that would be a laudable aim.
Mm. So I've got a few more questions here in the Q&A. I'm trying to keep the discussion focused on ones which are relevant for the new code rather than other aspects of the work. I've got one here I think is a good one and might be useful for people. It's an architect who's working in Australia. They want to know, is the code relevant to them? Do they have to adhere to the standards?
Yes, absolutely. There may be very individual circumstances. We thought about this. There may be very individual circumstances where it's not possible to meet the code because of your particular jurisdiction. I don't think they would apply in Australia. For example, there may be, you're expected to have professional indemnity insurance, and there are some jurisdictions in which IRB registered architects don't practice, that there is no PIA in that particular country. It's just not part of their legal and liability system. So quite clearly in those cases, you would be able to justify why you have averred from the code. What we couldn't think of is any situation for any architect in any country that wouldn't be able to meet the headline standards, to being honest, acting in the public interest, being competent, carrying out your practice diligently, communicating, collaborating, and showing each other's respect. They are non-negotiables for wherever you're practicing, but there will be variances in between.
Mhm. I've got another question here again, which I think is useful. Somebody has asked, are we going to be running any mandatory CPD in relation to the new code?
Well, at the moment, there are two mandatory CPD topics. One's in relation to building safety, one's in relation to sustainability. It's quite possible that that we could introduce a new mandatory topic in relation to the code. I don't know how kind of targeted or nebulous that would be because it's not really telling architects what, because the code is so wide, we're not really telling the architects what's the purpose of that. Um, but it's certainly something we could think about. I think it's more likely that if we did introduce mandatory CPD in relation to areas of the code, it would be in relation to a particular area of the code where we've identified a regulatory need.
I've got a question here from an anonymous attendee. They've asked, how does the ARB code relate to the REBA codes? Is there a relation?
Well, no, there isn't a direct relationship between that. I mean, some architects will be dual registered. Some architects will only be registered with ARB. I'm not quite sure the percentages. I think it's about well, near enough half and half, but there may be variances either way. One thing I can say is there are no conflicts as you would expect between the REBA code and the ARB code. And REBA are a really important stakeholder when we came to develop this, as they will continue to be as we develop the guidance. There are certainly no conflicts. If you're complying with one, then there's no reason you wouldn't be complying with the other.
We've got a question here from Andrew. It's a question around PII, and Andrew has asked, where does PII sit within the codes, within the new codes? Is PII required if an architect is not doing any design work and has no historic liabilities in terms of work, so has not worked in practice for over 30 years?
So I'll take the second part of that question first. No, there's no requirement. There's no requirement for architects to have PII just as a matter of course. You need to have liabilities that require coverage. It sits within standard 4, and there's some relatively decent, my ears decent, detailed guidance that sits as well as there's a guidance document on how architects should deal with having professional indemnity insurance. It's an expectation that architects who have liabilities, they will be covered by PI, not necessarily an architect's own PI, maybe their employer's PI or their organization's PI, but it will be covered by PI.
So I think I'm just looking through the questions here, and as I say, trying to keep this focused on stuff that's relevant for the code. So I might just run the second to last poll. So yeah, as I say, we're coming towards the end now. So that poll should be up on your screens. I can see that people are responding already, so that is good. As you will all know, all architects are now required to undertake and record CPD. Architects are free to choose their own activities, and a CPD activity can be anything that improves your ability to practice. So if you've learned something here today and feel this session has improved your ability to practice, you can record it as CPD. But what we'd like to know in this poll is if you're planning to participate in any further CPD activities related to the new code. It may be that you've been inspired by today's session to host a peer discussion, or maybe going to participate in some scenario-based training or practice with colleagues. So I'll leave that poll up for a moment. I'm just going to recap on some of the key points from today. So the new Architects Code will come into effect on the 1st of September. So now is the time to get familiar with the updated standards. You can access the full code and all of the published guidance topics on the ARB website. We'll share links for everything in a follow-up email. So I'll go to everybody who was here today and everybody who registered. We are currently consulting on guidance for 3 of those topics: managing conflicts of interest, managing finances appropriately, and raising concerns and whistleblowing. You can review that guidance on the ARB website, and we would encourage everybody here today to participate in that consultation and to share it to colleagues as well. You've got about a month on that consultation. It closes 31st of July, so end of this month. So I'm just going to close the current poll. I'm going to run one final one. And this final poll is just a feedback poll. So we just want to know, have you found today's session useful? Good to know for us. Great. I can see, yeah, 97% at the moment. So yeah, really glad to hear that you found today useful. So yeah, so finally, I just want to say thank you to Simon for being here today, making himself available to respond to your questions. Yeah, we're finishing a little bit early, but I don't think that's a bad thing when it's lunchtime. You get 20 minutes back. So, and yeah, I just want to say thank you to everybody else who joined us here today, and for your time and engagement. And yeah, if you do have questions, do please email us, or yeah, just get in contact when we send that follow-up email.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.